Greetings and welcome again to week 3 of our Sense seminar. We are glad that you have taken the time to join us this evening. And for those who will watch these videos at a later time, we are glad to be connected with you. We want to welcome you yet again to our week 3 of Sense September as we move throughout this month, exploring changing the narrative, the power of storytelling.
Yes, so that's been our overall theme, and each week we've kind of highlighted an aspect of changing the narrative. And this week's theme was when old narratives don't work. And so we recognize that, part of the process of changing the narrative is when we finally get to a point where we've been bumping up against these old narratives that no longer serve us as kind of the impetus to that change. And so we had a couple of voices of experience that we elevated this week who are joining us on our panel tonight. We have Reverend Lyle Gwen-Garrity, who offered her story in the workshop, Discerning a Business Model. She is a pastor in the PCUSA and an artist. She is also a creative entrepreneur seeking to fill the church with more color, paint, mystery, and creativity. She is the founder and creative director of A Sanctified Art, which is a collaborative arts ministry providing multimedia resources for worshiping communities. And her colleague was with us last week. Also this week, we have Cameron Gray, who provided the workshop Fundraising and In-Kind Donations. He is a Birmingham-born artist whose work focuses on Blackness in America. In 2020, Gray founded the Buxton Initiative, an organization that centers Blackness in the realms of art, music, literature, and film. And in 2021, he was the recipient of an Iowa American Rescue Plan grant and an Iowa Arts and Culture Resilience grant. And then using these awards, Gray conceived of and received permission to install permanent sculpture in a local Ames, Iowa park. And the sculpture is called Blacked Out Books, which functions not only as artwork, but as a little free library featuring books by Black authors, a first in the city's history.
And our wonderful keynote speaker who is familiar with our MBA social entrepreneurship program, tongue-tied, who has definitely been a part of the history of our program as a former Incubate partner. I want to introduce you to Reverend Sandhya, who is an anti-oppression consultant who particularly loves helping organizations get diversity, equity, and inclusion teams off the ground. Sandhya is the founder and former ED of the Oakland Peace Center, a collective of 40 organizations working to create equity, access, and dignity as a means of creating peace in Oakland and the Bay Area. As an ordained pastor with a master's in public policy, Sandhya is comfortable in the pulpit, on the picket line, or hanging out with friends over a good cup of tea and a good story. Sandhya's 5th book with Chalice Press, Rebels, Despots, and Saints, was just released earlier this year. We're glad to have with us this evening. Excuse my tongue tied, Reverend Sandhya.
Darnell, I'm really grateful. I'm really grateful to everyone who's here, and I'm really thrilled to hear the wisdom of Lyle and Cameron later on, because I've got a very specific way I'm coming at this question, and I'm hoping it will be useful to everyone who's tuning in, but I know that Cameron and Lyle will bring some insights from a different perspective that I think will fill out what I'm sharing a whole bunch. So I'm going to go ahead and share with y'all some slides as I talk. Sorry, y'all. I used to know how to do this. Forgive me. The slideshow feature just disappeared on me. If somebody would mind letting me know, can you see my PowerPoint slide? Yes, okay, great. Just wanted to make sure. Forgive me, y'all. So I was hoping to talk about stories that affect change, and I think the reason I wanted to start there is I'm going to take for granted that we know some of the old stories that we've been using to affect change have not always been working in our favor. So just to put myself in context, some of you know that I've been doing organizing work for almost 30 years at this point in my life. So bottom left, you can see a very young Shonda. I was 19 years old when we were protesting some major welfare reform initiatives back in '94. In the top, I'm actually one of a dozen people supporting an affordable housing resident who's speaking out on the conditions and rights of low-income residents in Oakland, California, back when I was doing housing justice work there. On the right, I'm at an event of the East Bay Alliance for a Sustainable Economy, where we are organizing across faith and community and labor for worker dignity. All of the work I've done my whole life has been grounded in my faith, even though not all of that work has been formally faith-based work. And so I've been trying to affect pretty significant, I've been a part of millions of people in this country trying to affect change for a really long time. And at a certain point in my journey of organizing, of nonprofit work, of faith-based and faith-rooted organizing, I felt like, and many of my movement colleagues, especially in Oakland, California, where I've been organizing for the past 20 years, 18 years, we had this shared experience that we were fighting harder and harder for smaller and smaller gains, and sometimes just to try to hold back the tide. And in the past 5 to 8 years, it has felt like no matter how hard we worked, it felt like the deck was stacked against us. Now, there are a whole bunch of things we could talk about related to why that is, related to the funding that anti-inclusion communities or organizations get, related to political shifts locally, nationally, and globally around neoliberalism instead of a radical justice movement. But one of the things that gave me hope for the first time in a long time was when I came across, and you may already know her work, but the work of Adrienne Marie Brown, when her book Emergent Strategy came out, one of the things she talked about as someone who had been organizing in very parallel spaces to the ones I was organizing in, as a woman of color who was leading a nonprofit on the left edge, was how we keep fighting harder and harder for smaller and smaller wins, and how there must be a different way to do this. Her book Emergent Strategy has 9 principles of building community to affect change, and one of her slogans is "Small is all." We recognize the power of what we're doing locally, what we're doing interpersonally, how we're living out the vision of beloved community that we want to see in the world, but also changing what we value, how we prioritize it. And so I really love what she has to say about telling stories in new ways. She's first and foremost an Octavia Butler scholar, and so it's as an Octavia Butler scholar that she says, "I believe that all organizing is science fiction, that we are shaping the future we long for and have not yet experienced. If you do not think of yourself as an organizer, I believe that pretty much every social entrepreneur is, on some level, doing community organizing, bringing people together around a shared vision that is intended to affect significant institutional, structural, systemic change. So I think you're an organizer, whether you identify that way or not. So when you hear me say that, know that I am talking about you." The second person who gave me a little bit of hope in the midst of a long period of I'll keep doing it, but is it really doing anything, was, and I'm sorry the name's kind of blurred, but a guy named Ian Haney Lopez. He's a legal scholar, and you may have come across his book Dog Whistle Politics, but his work Merge Left, I think, is even more interesting. Dog Whistle Politics says, here's what they're doing that is why our job is so hard at creating a just and inclusive community at the political level. And I want to be really clear, he's very much oriented around partisan political change making. That is not going to be everybody's priority here, but I still think he has a lot of lessons to teach us. And it is my priority. I promise not to talk about it too much, but it is absolutely part of what has brought me back to school where I am now. So I love his quote, in our diverse society, racism has been the plutocrat's scythe. You can tell he's a legal scholar, cutting down social solidarity to harvest obscene wealth and power. We all can and must tell this story. What I'm going to share with you about his work in a little bit is he tells a lot more than this story. He also tells what our story could be. That's one of the things that I'm hoping is valuable to you. Like I said, my reflections are going to be very technical because I'm hoping to give you a few potential tools to use that will serve you in your social entrepreneurship in the days to come. The third group organization experience that gave me a little bit of hope in the midst of being disheartened was an organization called the Center for Story-Based Strategy. I know these are a lot of words and you probably can't read them all, but the good news is this is a free PDF. If you sign up and join their list, you can get a copy of this yourself, and I can share that link later. But what they did was methodically think through how we tell stories that are helpful to bringing people alongside us. And I want to say that the thing that's similar between Ian Haney Lopez and the Center for Story-Based Strategy is they're clear that there's someone organizing against us. Adrienne Marie Brown, that's implicit in her work, but it's not as explicit. So she tends to feel much more homey for the more woo folks among us who don't like thinking about evil or sin or opposition. I've got a long career in political organizing, and so I am very comfortable thinking about opposition. What they talk about is the importance of these steps as a really effective way of bringing people into your movement, into your work, into your efforts for change. So you break down the power, you break down the opposition story. Here's what they're saying, but here's what they're really saying. That's kind of some of the dog whistle politics that Ian Haney Lopez talks about. Put your audience in the front row, make them feel like they are a part of this story, like they want to find out what happens next, that they are invested in the outcome. Craft your story, choose where to intervene. Do you want to mobilize people to disrupt the production of an item that's causing harm? Do you want to get them to stop purchasing something that's harmful? Do you want to get them involved in dismantling something that is causing harm? Do you want them to be mobilized to demand something different from their legislators? Do you want to help them realize the story they've been getting told all this time was a lie? So those are the points of intervention that community organizers talk about a lot. The point of production, the point of consumption, the point of destruction, the point of decision, the point of assumption. Choose how to intervene. What is it you want them to do? And then check your work. Is it affecting people? Is it drawing people in? Have you done it in a way that makes it memorable, that taps into emotion and not just intellect? Is it simple and short and easy to understand? So I loved coming across the work of the Center for Story-Based Strategy, and it began to really shape the way I told stories in the work to mobilize faith communities to engage in some of the organizing work I was doing. So some of you know I've written a few books. I get invited to talk places a lot as a result of that. It's one of my favorite things to do. If a class is studying something I've written and we get to just hang out and talk about it, I love that. There was one time I was talking to a chaplaincy class, a class on pastoral care. They were reading my book, Transforming Communities, which I particularly love because Transforming Communities is really intended as a handbook for community organizing. But since I don't use that phrase, a lot of people recognize how it can be useful to them, even if they don't think of themselves as community organizers. So the pastoral care class was reading this book about all these case studies on how regular people had transformed their neighborhoods and how that work was replicable. And there was this lovely pastor who said, you know, I really enjoy your book. I really enjoy what you're talking about. How would you try to convince people in my red rural congregation in the Midwest? I'm being vague in my markers, but my red rural Midwestern congregation. How would you convince them that they should care about this stuff? And I said, so I wouldn't try to convince them. And that's not because no one should. The point of assumption is one of those organizing places, but that's not my work. Over the course of many years of organizing, I've gotten to the point of realizing that my place in the movement for change is the work of helping people who already know something's wrong, but aren't quite sure what to do about it, to provide on-ramps for them. Now, much of my organizing work has been done in Oakland, California. There are people way to the left of me, much more radical, much more grounded in an amazing political analysis that couldn't do what I do because they do not have the patience for the folks who aren't already onboarded to how we do this. Their job is to motivate and empower the folks who are already starting to do the work of change and to help refine strategy with each other. Iron sharpening iron. Whereas my work isn't there. They help me get better as an organizer, but my contribution to the movement is really connecting with folks who are like, don't like what things are like now, have no idea what the first step is. That's who I'm communicating with. So sometimes the question that pastor asked me is phrased, but will it sell in Boise? Meaning, is this a message that will translate to everyone and particularly to the middle of the road folks who aren't against me, but aren't yet sure whether to be for me? And that currently is not where my work lies. And I think part of the work of telling a new story is realizing, am I trying to sell this in Boise or am I trying to sell it somewhere else? If I'm trying to sell it somewhere else, what am I trying to sell? Who is it I'm trying to sell it to? What's going to be helpful to them to bring them into the work? So I have shared a lot of things that indicate, you know, what I'm really passionate about is a good jobs benefit agreement in West Oakland that prioritizes living wage and union track jobs for Black and Brown legacy residents of Oakland. For example, that's a campaign I've worked on and have gotten faith communities involved in. That's the kind of thing that sets me on fire. That's where I feel like I am doing gospel work. And so I know that as I've shared these stories, you might be thinking, yeah, what does this have to do with me? Because your story is not my story and your audience isn't my audience. So for me, I do know that whether we are all politically engaged or whether we are all movement people or whether we are all, well, I know we are all justice minded because National Benevolent Association doesn't do anything but even if you don't think of yourself as an organizer, a movement person, a politically engaged activist, I think there are some things that we share in our commitment to social change, social transformation, social enterprise. And so I think these are questions that are helpful for all of us as we are refining our message. And you can tell that when I talk about storytelling, I'm talking about the story we're telling others to engage them in our work. So what change are you seeking to affect is a foundational question. If you're seeking to affect change, who is your audience? Where do you want to move them? What's your goal? Do you want to educate them? Do you want to motivate them? Do you want to empower or encourage them? And what's going to accomplish that, given what you know about your audience? Data, stories, framing it so they can see themselves in the change. You can see how some of this is kind of related to the Center for Story-Based Strategy model. And for me, those questions matter because I have also done a lot of work on informal messaging training for organizers in Oakland, many of whom have been shaped in the cauldron that is beautiful, radical organizing. It's the home of the Black Panther Party, and that legacy shapes a lot of our work. And so I've definitely worked with organizers who were like, right, I want to publish an editorial in the local paper in order to bring people on board with my campaign. And what they write is about how gentrifying corporations are destroying the culture of the city of Oakland, and we need to pass this policy in order to stop displacement of long-standing Black and brown communities. And I agree with everything they're saying. And pretty much everybody in the room agrees with everything they're saying. But if you're publishing an editorial, you're reaching a different audience. And you need to think about where you can move that audience and what will accomplish it, right? And so a screed that is inspiring to me is maybe not going to land on the regular Oakland Tribune newspaper subscriber in the same way. And it is unlikely that an op-ed is going to move somebody to taking political action. A newspaper, an op-ed, is best used to educate, to inform, to shift people's perspective. And the language used there and the message that we're orienting ourselves around is going to matter a lot in different ways than if it were simply intended to inspire and encourage me to keep doing the work I'm doing. And the tension that I think is important to acknowledge is in the midst of tailoring a message to a particular audience, we also have to ask ourselves who we are accountable to and how that's part of the message. I'm just sharing those questions, and now I'd like to share a little bit of what some of the things I was just talking about might look like in practice, and to give you a chance to maybe engage those things yourself. So one of the things I'd love for us to sit with is, how might you tell your community's story differently? Adrienne Marie Brown was giving a talk at the Ball Institute in Detroit, and she's embedded in Detroit and has been working there for many years and is a mentee of Grace Lee Boggs, kind of the patron saint of movement organizing in Detroit. And here's a little piece of her talk that's specifically around changing the narrative. She says, Detroit is the ultimate city of changing the story. Narrative is the key to our future. Detroit is dying. We see opportunity in crisis. Detroit is what the country has to look forward to. Time to right-size the city. We aren't leaving the land we have tilled. Now is the time to grow our souls. Detroit's a blank canvas. Detroit is a city full of survival stories and brilliance. Noticing stories? We notice stories. We create stories. And the last thing she says is, my friend Mia Herndon often says, capitalism is not failing. It is working for the elite. Beautifully. But in Detroit, lots of people are beginning to practice alternatives, even if we don't yet have language for it. I'd love for you to take a moment to think about the ways in which your community's story or your organization's story or your movement's story gets told by people who aren't invested in it or maybe even are opposed to it. How do they tell that story? As somebody who did social enterprise myself, as I got the Oakland Peace Center off the ground, I spent years confronting the story of how what we were trying to do was not possible. And it wasn't responsible because there were other places the money from the sale of that building could go, because the assumption was we should sell the building. There were lots of stories told about how impractical what we were trying to do was. And I love the fact that people in the congregation, the church that launched the Oakland Peace Center, could tell stories about how they were small in number, but all of us had a shared experience of losing people in the streets to violence, that was a thing that brought us together. And that while we didn't have much in terms of numbers or energy, we had a deep commitment to working with other people who had that experience and wanted to create something different. I love the fact that even though I'm no longer a part of that organization, I hear stories from people who said, oh, I met someone from the Oakland Peace Center the other day. They were talking about all the amazing things they're doing to X, Y, and Z. They're talking about how it was their idea a decade ago and no one believed in them, but look at all that they're accomplishing now. I love the fact that that is the story that keeps getting told, is of imagination, of shared experiences that lead to shared creativity, and a sense among a people that they are change makers in the face of a lot of people trying to say that that change wasn't possible. I do a lot of work around asset-based community development and inviting people to do an asset map of their community. And what people do is they list the institutions in their community that are helpful to the kind of work they're trying to do, the groups and informal organizations, the public spaces, the financial institutions and networks, the people and the gifts that they in the community bring to the kind of work we're trying to do. The one that I make sure people always work on is, what stories of your community are assets? This one's personal to me. I grew up, my family moved to the United States when I was about 3 years old. We moved to Akron, Ohio in the late 70s. And that was not an awesome time to be Asian in Akron, Ohio, because the narrative that was circulating all across the country was that Asians were the reasons that industry in the United States was falling apart. We didn't track hate crimes as carefully then, but I'm fairly certain that was a period of hate crimes surge that we don't talk about very much. Not a great time to grow up in Akron. I want to invite you to fast forward with me to 2012. This was the year that, at the time, 2012, the Obama administration was trying to bring Syrian refugees into the United States. I'm hesitating because it might have been 2016, so please forgive me if I got that date wrong. I think in terms of presidential cycles and not years. And there were a number of state governments, you may remember, that said, we'll refuse to take them they're Muslims, right? We don't have any obligation to take Muslims. Even if they didn't say it explicitly, they said it implicitly, and often they did say it explicitly. I was really proud of the Disciples of Christ at that point, because disciples churches all across the country said, we would love to receive refugees. And that was a really powerful story for me to experience, not as a refugee, but as an immigrant. But the reason I bring this up is I've told you my lived experience in Akron a little bit. And the mayor of Akron in, I believe it was 2016, wrote an op-ed and said, Akron would love your refugees. Akron is a city made great by refugees and immigrants and migrants. Immigrants from Italy, migrants from the South, from the African American community, immigrants from Germany, immigrants from Afghanistan, refugees from Afghanistan. This city is a great city because of immigrants and refugees and migrants, and we know the gifts that they bring, and we have grown strong because of the gifts they bring, and we want to continue to be that kind of city. Now, my lived experience was that was not the Akron I had grown up in, but the fact that that city was telling that story about itself still made me awfully proud to be a part of Akron. Our stories can help us become who we want to be. So I wanted to share with you an interview from Vox, the online magazine, with Ian Haney Lopez. That's the legal scholar I mentioned to you earlier, who wrote the book Merge Left, as well as Dog Whistle Politics. And here's something he said, and I wanted to share with you an example of the race, class, fusion messaging that he does, and that he has been training people across the country to do. I think he is underestimated in the impact he had in the 2020 election, for example. So he says, the race class narrative moves away from thinking about racism fundamentally as a conflict between whites and people of color. Instead, it says racial conflict is real, but it is funded and fueled by a very small class of economic titans for their own benefit. The real conflict we face is not between whites and people of color, but between an economic few and all the rest of us. Here's a version of that political message we tested. And just as an aside, once they refined it, they taught people all across, organizers all across the country how to use it. And what they were pushing back against, I think it's important context, is the narrative within the Democratic Party that you can't talk about race because it will alienate white voters. And Haney Lopez's research sought to refute that claim. So while he's saying, yeah, it's about race, but also, I think it's really important for you to know what he was saying is, and it's about race, to the Democratic Party that was afraid to talk about race because they thought it was a losing issue for them, because the only conversation about race that worked was race hatred, which was working for the other side. So the message they tested, and you can see where where that shows up, is no matter where we come from or what our color is, most of us work hard for our families. But today, certain politicians and their greedy lobbyists hurt everyone by handing kickbacks to the rich, defunding our schools, and threatening seniors with cutting Medicare and Social Security. Then they turn around and point the finger for hard times at poor families, Black people, and new immigrants. We need to join together with people from all walks of life to fight for our future, just like we won better wages, safer workspaces, and civil rights in our past. By joining together, we can elect new leaders who work for all of us, not just the wealthy few. This is a message of race fused to class. It starts with an expressed acknowledgement of race, but directs attention through a class lens. A race-class message is a message that says we are being intentionally divided, and the best response to intentional division is to build connections across those divisions, because only by coming together can we actually make this country work for all of our families. And if you will indulge me, I want to share with you an illustration of how this played out in an organizing and candidate recruitment campaign that I hope you will enjoy. I want to make sure I've got the audio going, yes.
Whether you're a Black working class woman in Columbus, Ohio, or a white father in Kentucky, or a Latina student in Phoenix, it is the same ruling class using the same played out tactics to make us hate each other based on race, gender, religion, and sexuality. They are trying to make us point fingers in the wrong direction while we're all struggling and they are thriving. And we're struggling to build the families that we want with access to the healthcare that we need, provided by the jobs that bring us joy in order to manage the crippling debt from those fun yet incredibly expensive degrees that we kind of don't really use. We gotta change who's in charge. It's time to give someone else a chance. And it's on all of us to actually support and cheer on a new generation of leaders. We choose us. We choose us. Don't you choose us? I would choose us. Us. Duh.
I love that video so much. I choose her for sure. I want to acknowledge that this work can be hard. I wanted to share just a personal story. It's funny because I've been doing a lot of grassroots organizing for a really long time, and I've been doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work for a little bit less time. I've been doing anti-oppression trainings for decades and started doing DEI as kind of a side hustle. And for the past couple of years, it's been my full-time work. I have worked really hard to make it as approachable as possible, but I've brought those same questions I shared with you earlier into how I structure my work, including that last question: who am I accountable to? As well as who's my audience? The tension I face is sometimes I'm doing a training for a diversity of people from a diversity of organizations, and they're not necessarily all my audience, because as I mentioned earlier, I've finally done the discernment to realize there, for me, are so many people in the world who know something's wrong with the world the way it is and don't know where to start to change things, that I don't think it's a good use of my time to convince people who are against me that they should agree with me. Now, in corporate DEI work, that is a real tension, because part of the point of corporate DEI work is to encourage those who are feeling beleaguered while also persuading those who are part of why the other folks are feeling beleaguered. It's very much a walking on water kind of thing. It really does take a miracle to accomplish that. And I've decided at this point in my career, I can't do it. So I speak to my audience. I tend not to try to convince people that racism and sexism and heterosexism and classism in the workplace are real. I take it for granted. I take it as a given, and I let folks know up front, I am speaking out of the assumption that we all know that to be true and don't need to be persuaded of it, and that my time with them will be oriented around what do we do about it? What are effective, tested, measurable strategies to address that reality in the workplace? I feel pretty good about my work. I feel like I do a good job with it. And I was recently doing a workshop, about 50, 75 people from a number of different organizations and companies. And I could tell that the person in the second row, just to the right side of the aisle, who was directly in my line of sight, was unconvinced and was a little annoyed with my lack of backing up my case for why anti-heterosexist strategies in the workplace were important. For example, And I had a moment, even though I've done all of this work, even though I've decided who my audience is, what my strategy is, what it is I'm trying to accomplish over the course of my time with folks, I had a moment of, oh, what do I do to fix this? Because I live in the same world that you do, where I have been trained to be particularly anxious about certain people's negative feedback, because by and large, they're the ones with the most power. And so I wanted to share that story just because it's really important to me to acknowledge how hard it is to tell a new story. Because whenever we do it, we're being countercultural. And by definition, being countercultural means we're in a distinct minority. It may be a visionary minority. It may be a minority who's on the right track. It may be a minority who 5 years down the road will seem like the majority. Because I'll tell you what, the Oakland Peace Center is no longer considered unviable. It's considered a good model for where churches are heading these days. But in the midst of that moment where it is not yet the norm, where it is still revolutionary, it can be easy to feel like, oh, this isn't going anywhere. No one else is on my team. Even what did I do wrong? I had a moment to check in with myself because I do think it's always worth doing a check to remind myself what my goal was when I walked into the room, what I had done to try to accomplish that, and to assess whether I had done so. And for me, the people I'm accountable to in that particular room, first and foremost, are queer folks, are working folk, poor folks, are people of color. And if it was not causing them harm and it was making their jobs easier, if it was creating a path that would make life easier for them, for us, in those workplaces, then I had accomplished what I had set out to do, particularly given the fact that I don't think we can always do it by ourselves, but there were a lot of straight cis white allies in the room who were also feeling empowered, excited about possibilities, and ready to implement change. So doing the gut check and checking in on what it was you were setting out to do and whether you're on the right track is always worth doing. And sometimes I haven't, and I have to do some tweaking. But I did want to share, sometimes even when I'm getting it right, it feels like I'm getting it wrong, which is why we need a team of fellow storytellers to check in with. Oh, sorry. Jen Okri is a Nigerian author who I think highlights the importance of the work that we are seeking to do when we want to tell a new story. And Ben Okri says, to poison a nation, poison its stories. A demoralized nation tells demoralized stories to itself. Beware of the storytellers who are not fully conscious of the importance of their gifts and who are irresponsible in the application of their art. Sorry, I chose a version of that slide that cuts off at the wrong place. That was as far as I wanted it to go. I told you the Akron story partly knowing that this slide was coming up because the Akron I grew up in was an Akron that told stories of how mighty it used to be, how great it used to be. And in the midst of those stories, it was also telling stories of why it's no longer great. And often those kinds of stories result in figuring out who's to blame and targeting often misplaced aggression at that community, whether it's immigrants or Black people or queer people or poor people. It's part of why I wanted to share with you the Adrienne Marie Brown stories, because every story she tells is countering a negative story. And sometimes a story that doesn't seem negative. One of the stories she mentioned she was countering was Detroit is a blank slate. That's the story that venture capitalists tell about Detroit. That's the story that land developers tell about Detroit. It's not that different from the stories that got told about the frontier by people who were not indigenous. And so when Adrienne Marie Brown says, no, this is not a blank slate of a city. This is a story with this is a city with many stories of resistance, resilience, survival. This is not a clean slate. This is not an empty space that you can do with whatever you want. So when she tells this narrative of Detroit as a city of survival and resilience, it's not just that story. It's also a counter narrative to the story of the people who are trying to wipe out her community. And that, I think, is the power of stories. I apologize for wrapping up a little early. I had a little bit of time carved out for small groups, forgetting what the format of today was like. So I think I just want to close with the invitation for us to reflect on what is our new story, and to create a little extra time with the rest of the panel, because I know that you come at this from some very parallel places and also from very unique places. And I'm excited to hear your reflections on any of the storytelling strategy I've shared, or also I know Ashley has some great questions for us.
Yeah, thank you. That, I mean, I'm over here just like writing out all my notes, and thank you for such wisdom and speaking from your lived experience. And I'm excited for this conversation, and I get to kind of start us off in this continued spirit of introductions and letting our audience get to know the rest of the panel. I want to invite Cameron and then Reverend Lyle, and then Sandhya, you're welcome to chime in. As kind of an introductory question, what is the system or narrative that you are rewriting? And where are you in that journey of writing a new story?
Firstly, before I begin to answer that question, Sean, I want to thank you again for your candid and beautiful presentation today. One thing that really struck me, that really hit me hard, and I wrote it down within my notes as I was taking notes as you were discussing these things, or the beauty of talking about self-doubt and that feeling when it comes to beginning something new, right? Of like, you know, I when we begin these kind of endeavors, a lot of people, you always, before you start to share this with people, like, hey, I'm thinking about doing these particular thing or starting this particular organization. And during that particular time, you have a lot of people who are like, oh, you're crazy for doing that. Or, you know, there's this notion of like, well, how are you going to support yourself? And how are you going to find these other aspects of, you know, regular needs that come in the aspect of living in the world that we have to have. And I really appreciate to know that because like sometimes you feel alone, and I'm very happy that is being acknowledged even within your presentations, because I think a lot of people forget to acknowledge that aspect of it. And so when you are beginning that production of the particular, you know, endeavor that you're starting, you think that this is something that is only happening to you, like that this is this imposter syndrome that you're having as you're trying to push these thoughts forward and begin this grassroots organization. You think that is something that's solely an experience that you're having, that all these other people who started these organizations that became really beautiful things, they didn't have that because they, you know, they always had that support, and that's not always the case. And so I thought that was really a beautiful point to add within your presentation. I really appreciated that. Now, going to your question, Ashley, the kind of narrative that I'm trying to do here in Ames, Iowa, is this notion that kind of going back and what I was praising you, Shonda, on doing in your presentation, when I first had a couple of ideas of wanting to do something different here in Ames, because when I first moved here, there wasn't that many Black artists in this particular community, nor were there many artists working in the field of discussing race and really trying to not only come to terms with it and what it actually means within a white space, but then come to terms with it within my own psyche of understanding of who I am as a Black individual living in Ames, Iowa. And so understanding that basis of understanding where I was coming from, you know, two places that were very diverse in Birmingham, Alabama, and St. Louis, this was a huge cultural shift for myself. And so, like most people do, we conversate and we go talk to other people who've been in the community longer than we have to understand how they manage themselves within this particular spaces and also kept themselves sane. And during that time, you keep hearing these things of like, well, you should leave. You should, once you get your degree, you should go. You should do other things. This place isn't built for that kind of community that you want to do, or the things that you're trying to strive to do. Community-based work is not going to thrive here because, you know, we've seen this happen, and they give you this onslaught of historical, you know, confirmation to this negative aspect that they have upon the community that you exist in. And so once I finished, you know, my MFA and got my grad degree, I had a decision to make of like, am I going to listen to those particular narratives that were pushed to me that though may be true, because I'm not negating people's true experiences, but am I going to kind of have blind faith in my own cultural know-how of doing things to push past that and continue on this endeavor that I feel in my heart and truly believe in, that this community would truly benefit from? Or am I going to then just accept what they say and continue on and been, you know, leaving Ames or Iowa and then going off into my own, you know, artistic career in the Chicago or, you know, or in LA? And so understanding that narrative that I had to sit on and really deal with, because and I think that was the scariest part of it all, right? Is understanding this history that I know to be somewhat true, because these are personal experiences that people are giving me. To then actively go against that is it's a hard thing to do. It's almost saying like, I know this stove is hot, but I'm going to touch it anyway, because there's that notion of like, there's thrill in that, but then there's also this notion of like, you're going against your better judgment, right? You're going against this thing within yourself of self-preservation, but then also your own heart too as well, because you don't want to fail. You don't want these things to fail within the category that you're in or the world that you're in. And so it was a bold choice to do that. But then like, as I really got into it and like really started to push these thoughts and narratives to other people and like really started to connect with the community, it was really beautiful to see those particular narratives that were given to me being dissolved and really becoming smaller, and those worries becoming smaller, because I know that I have a support system. I know that there, and maybe that's because of an influx of people coming into the community that wasn't there when people came in. And so it's like, those are also other things that you have to consider when you're starting these things, is because there might be talking about 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And then you're in a different, and then also socially and politically, there's a lot of things that are happening that force people to actually want to make change within their own communities. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question fully, but that I just trying to propagate black lives and black beauty within a predominantly white space, really, I guess, and the possibility of that. Mm.
Lyle?
Thank you, Cameron. It's really wonderful to hear about your work, and thank you, Sandhya, for your keynote. And I'm thinking about how we bring people alongside us in these stories and the story shifting narratives. So I'm thinking about what is the narrative that we at A Sanctified Art are trying to live into, and what comes to mind is that we are really trying to invite the modern day church to once again become a patron of the arts, one of the primary patrons of the arts. And part of that is really valuing the work of artists and valuing visual art and creative tools. And so I think a lot of the paradigm shifting we've been trying to do is that, well, let me back up and say that A Sanctified Art is a collective. So I'm really representing many creators, many artists and writers and musicians and pastors. And we primarily serve mainline Protestant denominations. And in a lot of those denominations, worship is generally a space where you sing and you read words from a page, and you speak words aloud, and you pray words, right? And so I think A Sanctified Art really came from this deep longing for a deeply embodied, creative spirituality where you can step into a sanctuary and know that your full self is welcome there. And we know that visual art can once again become a real valuable form of proclamation, that art can be expansive, that art can form us and shape us and expand imagination, not limit it. In a lot of these denominations, there's a longstanding tradition of propagating images of whiteness. And sometimes I'm deeply concerned that those images can inadvertently or sometimes purposely equate whiteness with holiness. And so at A Sanctified Art, we're really interested in how art can be used as a tool for expanding imagination, and inviting people from all different backgrounds and cultures and races to see themselves reflected in the story, the sacred stories that we preach on, that we pray about, and to see themselves and have a real imagination that they belong there, that we all belong in these sacred stories. And I think the biggest thing that really, I think we're really trying to pursue is just helping people in faith communities reconnect with tools of creativity. Brene Brown was doing some research about a decade ago around the gifts of imperfection, and she was doing some work on wholeheartedness, and she found a really strong link to creativity. And in her research, it basically backs up what every artist I know says, is that there is no such thing as creative people and non-creative people. There's just people who use their creativity and people who don't. And so I think that same thinking applies to churches. I really believe that there's no such thing as creative churches or non-creative churches. There's just churches who use their creativity and churches who don't. And in her research, she found that unused creativity is not benign. Unused creativity is not benign. It turns into things like shame and regret and apathy and dysfunction. And so I'm really concerned about unused creativity in our faith communities. And I think that's really the heart of what A Sanctified Art is about, is trying to reintegrate art and creativity as tools for spiritual formation.
I don't know if you want me to jump in on this or not. You know, I was thinking about, I knew I was going to love getting to be on in a discussion with Cameron and Lyle. I'm so grateful. Y'all are just brilliant. And doing such inspiring work. I love it. So I found myself thinking that, yeah, I come from a culture where we are not encouraged to brag about anything that we've done or be, you know, too proud, right? There is definitely a kind of an Asian culture of, you know, self abnegation. So I think my ancestors are cringing as I say, the thing that I am proudest of In the work that I've done in the past 5 years, it's been similar in, I've gotten to work with a lot of seminary students who are launching social enterprises and doing social transformation work. And I've also gotten to work with a lot of nonprofits that are trying to go really deep in their lived practice of anti-oppression. And maybe I'm a little depressed about this, but I'm also really proud of this one question that seems to be paradigm shifting and helps people tell a different story for themselves, because all questions have assumptions embedded in them the same way that all stories do. And the question I always ask early on in my process, whether it's working with students or whether it's working with nonprofits, is how will people most impacted by injustice be at the center of how you seek to solve the problem you're seeking to solve? And just the fact that I ask that question means they're telling a different story. And sometimes they notice it and sometimes they don't. And it doesn't really matter whether they notice it or not, as long as they're telling that story about how their way of doing this work makes sure to place at the center of decision-making and ideally of power the people who are most directly impacted by the injustice they're seeking to solve.
Thank you for you all's insight and reflections around this particular question that was raised by Ashley. As we think about paradigm shifting and changing stories, as you all are seeking to do in your own context, in your own way, I'm curious, what has been one of the biggest and most consistent frustrations you have as you seek to change paradigms, shift paradigms, and change stories? Anybody on the panel can take that question.
Some of you all know I went back to school. I'm doing a PhD in Philadelphia, is where I am right now. So I'm not actually on occupied Ohlone territory. But the reason I came back was I have this vision for launching a multi-faith religious left think tank, because the hellscape we're living in right now is the result of 50 years of intentional organizing by the religious right and by think tanks like the Heritage Foundation. And I think we are actually ready for our version of the Heritage Foundation. And what I've found, and it's been hard my whole life, and I don't know that there's a good way of doing it, is the people who are inspired by that radical vision for what America can be, and the people who are enthusiastically religious, and the people who are enthusiastically committed to a multi-faith vision, and the people who are deeply committed to preserving deep democracy that is grounded in a secular form of governance, that's a Venn diagram with not as much overlap as I would like. And so when I'm thinking about who my audience is and what their power is and what stories we're trying to transform just by working together, that's been hard work my entire organizing career, and for some reason it hasn't gotten easier.
Yeah, I'll say to piggyback off of that, one of my biggest frustrations that like I've always been dealing with, and I'm trying to like mitigate my own thought process on that, of like not having a negative thought towards other people when I hear this kind of stuff or experience it, are people really appreciating or saying that to my face of like, hey, we really appreciate what you're doing for the community. This is great. Keep it up. And then like when I like, oh, well, hey, well, you could help. Like, if you like, I don't have to do this. I don't have to do this by myself. Like, I have these particular things that I need to help with. You're like, oh, I appreciate that, but like, I don't want to get in there, but like, I'll support you from over here, and you just keep doing what you're doing. And so like that stuff used to bother me, or even like that, or them talking bad about the community that you're trying to better, and then not being like, so then what are you doing? Like, I don't, you can't really, and that's something I've always told people, is like, you can't complain about something that you're not trying to actively fix. You don't have a right of doing that, because you're not doing anything to make the place that you're at better. And so like, and I try to not allow myself to have like animosity or have negative connotations to these particular people. But I think it is something that needs to be said, that needs to be acknowledged, about the lack of action and apathy. You're only helping create what you despise. And so the only way that you can start to mold the community in which you want to see for your own community is being active. And when you're doing that, you're choosing to accept the world that in which you are wanting to change. So therefore, you're just speaking but not doing. And I don't like people who can't back up what they're talking about or showing action about what they're doing. It just negates everything. You're just trying to make yourself seem better rather than actually being a better person, by helping the community in which you want to help or build up.
I'll take this question and maybe a little bit of a different direction, because I'm going to speak to sustaining organizations, and I'm going to speak from more of an organizational perspective. But I think that with a sanctified art, one of the ongoing challenges we always have is just knowing our capacity for what we can actually create, because we have, and I hope this resonates for anybody who has built something from a vision, runs a business or runs any sort of organization or nonprofit, that hopefully, if you are really in alignment with your passion and your mission and your vision, that you are going to have this constant wellspring of ideas and visions and dreams that you want to bring forth and pursue. And I think even though we are there's a small but mighty team that we bring forth a lot of those ideas into reality, that there is this ongoing discernment process around what can we do. And time feels like our most scarce resource sometimes. And we try not to have a scarcity mindset. But when you have creative process is often very unpredictable, and creative process can't always be put in a predictable timeline. And so when you're giving yourself fully to a work of art, or you're giving yourself fully to any sort of big project, especially a collaborative one, which is all of our work is rooted in collaboration, and collaboration is so generative and valuable and also messy. And so I think just the ongoing frustration or challenge that we find ourselves in is, what are the containers, what are the structures that we need to be mindful of, whether that's timelines, our own well-being, how much we can actually give in terms of what hours we can give, and deadlines, right? Like all of the containers to bring forth these visions, to bring forth these creative ideas, to move them from the dream into something real.
It's beautiful. I love that we have a panel that comes from several different perspectives here. And so I just want to remind our listeners, if you're watching on Facebook or on YouTube, you're welcome to place questions for our panel in the chat, and then our tech support will provide those to us and we can speak to them. But one of the things, Cameron, that you were speaking about earlier was that experience of starting off, and it can feel lonely, it can feel isolating. And so, you know, especially because you're in a location where demographically that's like a realistic, that's a reality for you. What have been some of the things that you've done to bring people into this new narrative? What have been some of your strategies? I know that you spoke to it some in your workshop and the recording that you provided, but how have you garnered that kind of buy-in from the community? And then if either of you, Shonda or Lyle, afterwards, if you want to share about, you know, how you've kind of looped people into this new story you're trying to write.
For sure. Before, and again, I always have like something to say that like after Chandra or Lyle says something, and Lyle, something that you said that like really hit me too as well, like even personally, because that's something I'm currently going through, is this aspect of like personal and how that affects what you're trying to do too as well. Of like, even though like you could come into the year being like, oh, this is the time frame we're going to be doing all these things, and it's going to be exciting, and we're going to bring these new projects into play, and it's going to be it's going to be wonderful, right? And then like there's a tragedy that happens within your life, or something to that degree, that then like turns everything off, which then like becomes that frustration of, now the frustration is not only on, oh, how am I going to push, you know, this organization forward if I can't even go forward, you know what I mean? And so it's like, I love that you hit on that point too, because I think that's another thing that we don't rarely see, or talk about, is that frustration that one can put on oneself too as well, of not reaching those particular goals, or not reaching those, or doing those proposed programs in which you have planned for that particular year. So I thank you for bringing up that particular aspect of the process, because I think, again, as someone going through that currently and working my way through it and on my way out, that was something that I did not foresee. And, you know, with good support system, people who showing love helped me get out of it. So thank you for that. Now, to go towards Ashley's question, well, when I was thinking about Blacked Out Books and like how I was going to make this particular thing happen, I kind of put it out kind of like the way Shonda kind of set up that of like the what, when, why am I doing this particular project. I kind of put that out really on my Instagram first, to just to see what would happen, and like just to pull that out to my big community that I've somewhat acquired, but then it's continuing to grow as time progresses, and all to that notion. And then once I did that, I also realized that there were going to be some aspects of this that not only requires money, but then concrete things. So I'm looking for books, right? Like it's not just, you know, oh, we get the money, then you buy all the books. No, I want to build something somewhat organically. I think that was like the biggest part of this whole thing, is like, I want the community, but not only the community within Ames, but the community surrounding Ames or in the nation, to be able to contribute to this particular thing. And so it started out there, and I got a lot of big responses of people connecting me in with different bookstores around their local towns, and then they started sending me stuff, and then they would tell other libraries and other bookstores about that particular about this particular endeavor. And then once I started to see a lot of bookstores, I was like, oh, well, I know we have local bookstores here that I could possibly have some type of connection to. And so then that began my relationship with who a friend of mine worked at one. And then that's another way that we got a lot of our book acquisitions, was basically if like when they would get new books in, they had a little ding on them, and they couldn't put them on the shelf, they would just directly come to me. And so that started that little kind of connection there, that concrete relationship. And then you start to think about other ways of like, okay, well, I know the the library has a lot of books that, you know, they get from donations that people have, that they just sit in the back of the library. And so then I reach out to them of like, hey, I'm starting this project, and I know y'all have like a book sale too during this particular period. I was just wondering if I could, you know, get in a little early and just go sift through all your materials and media to bring a part of this particular project. And they were very receptive to that. And, you know, that turned into another beautiful relationship of another big, you know, acquisition. So I think I got at least 300 to 400 books just purely on going through, sifting through their old collection and sifting through their donations. And that's always been like a beautiful thing of like this continuous base of revolving door of like every 4 months I get to go back and like get another 100 books. And so like that's helped me. And then there's also stuff that I'm visibly doing, but then I'm also, whenever I go out of town, like I went to St. Louis for my birthday last year, and there's a local bookstore that I used to love going to. And so I talked to them. The owner was still there, that still remembered me when I came in there. So talking to them and possibly building up those relationships. But sometimes you just have to reach out to folks, and sometimes they work out and sometimes it doesn't. But it's not always about funds. It's always about how can I build up a base that can facilitate the things that I want to do. So like if you need chairs, it's like, hey, going to the local gym or the local Parks and Rec and see if they can donate chairs for your particular event. Or, like if you need sound or a venue for a particular thing to happen, just reaching out to those particular people to make these visions come true. Like, I think that's something that we always forget, is that the resources are there. You just have to go look for them. And it might require more than just an email. It might you actually having to go to that spot to actually talk to them about what you're trying to do. And then that sometimes turns into something else of other people wanting to help out or telling you other places to go to help build the thing that you're trying to do. So like I was mentioning this project when I was going to get my car fixed, and the guy was like, hey, well, this is a painter that we always use to help our particular enamel for painting your big project. You should probably reach out to them. And like on that day, he got on the phone with the person that I was needing to talk to. And so it's a really beautiful thing to, like, the more you talk about it with people, the more you kind of live that particular cause, to where it's like second nature when you're talking to people about the particular project. You'll be very surprised about how many different resources just come to you based on the candor and the love in which you speak about your particular organization and the cause in which you're working on.
So busy soaking in the wisdom of Cameron and Lyle. Remind me the question.
I'm like, oh, I don't remember.
You've forgotten too, because you were too busy drinking in the wisdom too. Yeah.
It was, how have you looped people into your story, especially for those of us who have, felt pulled and called to respond and are starting off maybe feeling a little alone in that? How do you get people to join you? Yeah,
right. Which is why I was drinking in their wisdom, because I was like, oh, that's good. Both of you. That was good reminders for me. I feel like Darnell knows me well enough to have invited me knowing that I was going to complicate things. So, because I learned that from you, really. One of the things that I just want to go ahead and name that is complicated, and sometimes I feel like it is awful and I have to figure out how to fix it, and sometimes I'm like, that is just the way it is. I mean, anybody who's tuned in can tell Cameron and Lyle are charismatic AF, right? Like, and that's part of what makes it work in the beginning. And I hate that because it feels counter to everything I believe about the gospel. And I think I've gotten in my own way trying to not have that be the case. And whenever I have completely embraced it, it has blown up in my face because I am trying to do radical communitarian work. And at the same time, if I pretend that that's not in the mix, it comes at a cost to the work. I have not figured out what to do with that. And I feel like, I don't know that this is as true in pure church spaces, but certainly in movement spaces, and particularly in QT-POC movement spaces, we're really wrestling with a tension right now about us all knowing that the charismatic leader is an unhealthy model. And the only solution we've come up with so far is being really angry at the charismatic leader. And that's not sustainable. But I don't know what works in its place yet. And that's part of the news story I'm trying to figure out how to write. And I have tried, there have been a couple of, I am not sorry not to be running a nonprofit these days, because there were a couple of staff blowups where I'm like, I know what the solution is. Bring in other charismatic leaders, which did not go well at all. All of us got bruised. All of our rough parts bumped up against each other's. It was harmful. And in movement spaces, I have felt like some of the pressure has been on me to be less charismatic, to dim my light because other people felt outshone. And that's not quite right either. And again, I'm still at a loss. I hate to ask actually any of the four of you if you have some wisdom on this, because it is something I'm trying to figure out how not to replicate with my next thing. And I haven't figured it out yet. And I have not seen, no matter how radical, I have not seen any organizations that have been able to find an alternative that is also sustainable.
Yeah, like you bring up a good point. This notion of like, it's always that rambunctious person that's in the front trying to do these particular things to get everyone excited to do the thing, which you would think inherently that what you're speaking is truth, right? And so therefore, if you're giving people truth, then they will be able to see that regardless of whatever envelope you put that truth in, right? Like you're able to visualize this is what needs to happen. And so therefore that should be enough for people to just buy into the thing. It's not about being this rambunctious person who's able to get your attention quickly and effectively and use the words correctly. It's about, no, we both know that this is what we want to do. So therefore, everyone just help that person do the thing because we know that our community could benefit from it. And like, I don't know, as a person who's like, you're right, like I think when I first started it, there was a lot more energy that I had for it, but then was posting every day and was doing this, but then you're right, there was an aspect of myself that was like, what, like it sucks the life out of you because it's like, I'm always pushing myself forward, but then what am I receiving, right? Like, of course, I'm receiving funds and encouragement and all that kind of stuff, but it's like, I still need more than that as like physical support or people being around me or like other people helping me do this because it's a lot, you put a lot on that shoulders. And like, because of that, and you bearing the grunt of all of that, and if it fails, you bear the grunt of that. If something slips up, you bear the grunt of that. It makes you, it's a lot to take on. And so you can't be that rambunctious, high fire person all the time, constantly, because you're taking on that weight, right? And so it's like, I don't know. And like, as a person who is like kind of working towards that same aspect of it too, of like not posting as much, kind of being quiet and still working on the projects, of course, the projects never go. And I'm still functioning and things are still happening, but it's not being on that public level is I guess I don't know until I finish what I'm doing, right? Like there, you have no barometer because you rarely see that, right? In our fields, you rarely see people not mass posting and not doing that. And so until I get this particular project I'm working on right now through, then I'll see, did it hit the way I wanted to hit? But then at the end of the day, one thing that I always understand is that it's still going to be a thing regardless if I talk about it or not. So there's going to be a point that they're going to bear witness to all the work I'm doing. So does it really matter at the end of the day? Like, it's going to exist. It doesn't matter how you heard about it, how I was pushing that narrative to you. I know the work that I'm doing is not going to fall on deaf ears. The people I've talked about it are really appreciative of it. So does it matter that I'm not talking about it as much? Because, I have a deadline. I know when it's going up. I know all of these things. So it's like, after that, then we'll see what happens after that. But like, I'm curious. And like I said, I don't know until it's over if it even matters at the end of the day. I don't know if it does. Yeah.
So friends, I appreciate how this panel is engaging each other, and this is everybody's first time meeting, I believe. But the synergy that's happening among the panelists. I want to pose a question that comes from our chat, which will go to our keynote speaker, as I believe it kind of fitting for what you shared earlier in your keynote address. And then we'll close out with questions that are specific to both Cameron and Lau, who've also released this week their pre-recorded workshops. So we want to kind of highlight some questions that may emerge from their workshops as you watch them independently. But the question in the chat comes from Bill, and this is again for Shonda. What wisdom would you be willing to share with us from the intersection of your personal narrative versus story and the narrative that you and the community are discerning? One more time. What wisdom would you be willing to share with us from the intersection of your personal narrative and the narrative that you are and the community are discerning?
I really appreciate that, Bill. Thank you. So some of you have heard the story of how I came to First Christian Church of Oakland as a pastor in spring of 2006, and it was a congregation with 10 in worship in a 40,000 square foot building that dated back to 1929. And early on in my time with them, we did a little visioning around what it was they got out of being at First Christian Church of Oakland, because that was a congregation that was predominantly African American, not because it had always been, but because the couple of integrating families had stayed in Oakland while everybody else left. So a congregation of 1,500 that had 2 Black families in the 1950s was down to a congregation of 20 with members of those same families by 2006, because of white flight, because of gentrification, well, not because of gentrification yet, but because of disinvestment in urban communities, because of the crack epidemic, all of which had affected members of that congregation and the building itself, which was located next to the apartment of the largest drug dealer in all of Oakland. So they had quite a few stories of things that had gone on in their parking lot. So one of the things they named that they got out of First Christian Church of Oakland coming there, even though they had dealt with a lot of hardships to keep those doors open, was that it was a place of peace and tranquility in the midst of violence. And at the time, Oakland was considered they had the highest homicide rate in the country. And it was interesting because people often assume that the Oakland Peace Center was my brainchild. And I often say, you all know me well enough to know that I would have founded a racial equity center, not a peace center. That's been my jam most of my whole life. But in terms of my personal story, the thing that I hadn't thought about until a couple of years into the Oakland Peace Center emerging out of those visioning conversations was, I didn't grow up in Oakland. As you all know, I grew up in Akron. But maybe the most formative experience of my life was when my boyfriend shot his best friend on our college campus, shot and killed him and ended up in prison. So I was pretty young when I got my first taste of the impacts of gun violence, the impacts of gun access, the impact of the prison industrial complex on the families around the perpetrator, the shame that is wrapped up in being part of that family, the way that's built into even visiting someone in prison. I was pretty young when I learned that the suppression of who we are can result in violence that is devastating to all sorts of people. Important life experience, important part of my narrative, shaped an awful lot of who I am in the world. But I hadn't put it into conversation with what was going on with my congregation and their lived experiences, simply because it had happened in Baltimore instead of in Oakland. So it took me a while to realize that those stories were connected. In fact, the moment I realized it was when I was talking with Leah Skoll, who's this amazing pastor. She wrote the book I Heart Sex Workers for Chalice Press. She used to do a lot of organizing with sex workers and was one of the few pastors I knew who knew how to navigate issues around human trafficking and dignity of sex workers and not thinking that those were in competition with each other. She's one of my favorite people. And the first time we met, she said, you know, it strikes me that pretty much all of the work of justice we do tends to be wrapped up in our own trauma. And I was like, maybe for her, because she said, you know, I wasn't a sex worker, but I had experienced sexual trauma. And that is true of almost, not all, but almost all of the women I work with. And I was like, that's funny. That's probably true for her. But I set up this peace center and I'm not really, you know, directly impacted. Oh. It took me, the Oakland Peace Center had existed for several years by the time this conversation happened. And so I think a lot about Leah saying the point of our justice work is often one step removed from our personal trauma. And I don't know that that's a bad thing. I think there is something about us being able to have very basic connections so that when someone I knew in Oakland ended up in jail, I already knew how to navigate that system. I knew how to show up well. And when fast food workers asked me to get arrested with them because they were going to get treated better if there was a pastor in the jail cell with them, I knew what that was going to be like, at least a little bit. There were ways that it showed up in the work I was called to do that I hadn't really anticipated being the case. But I think there can be something pretty beautiful about, as long as we're doing our own work, as long as we're continuing to address our traumas and keep healing, I think there can be something beautiful about us being able to show up with other people who are likewise doing their own healing and trying to create healing in the community around that issue.
I think, you know, one of the definitions and explanations that Darnell and I name often when we're trying to explain what is this phrase, social entrepreneurship, and we talk about, you know, God hearing the cries of God's people, and it's a faithful response to the cries of God's people, that's the impetus behind any kind of social impact work, that we're responding to the cries of people. And I think, at least for me and in my life, I know the topics and the pain that I am quick to shed a tear over, or that I hear and I recognize are ones that I've shed in my own life as well, like that it touches home. And so I appreciate Shonda, what you're naming. Bill says, thank you. I appreciate your response. One step removed from our personal trauma. Grateful for all the panelists in this important conversation. I echo that. And in as a way of wrapping up tonight, and the goodness, and as Darnell said, the engagement, your wisdom, I want to start with Lyle, and then hear perhaps Cameron and then Shonda. But what do you do when you're weary from the effort that it takes? I know we spoke about this a little bit, but for those who are on the cusp of stepping into this work, or maybe they're already responding to the cries of God's people, I am glad that we can be realistic and we can name that pushing up against old narratives and writing new narratives, that is hard, good work. But what do you do to sustain yourself, and how do you keep going?
When I heard that question, I immediately thought of a moment when I was probably about 6 or 8 months into having launched a sanctified art officially into the world and growing it slowly and steadily. And I was trying to make it financially stable and sustainable so that we could keep doing this passionate work that we care about. And I don't believe that, and I don't really believe in overnight success. Maybe some people have that, but I have not experienced it. And I just remember admitting, maybe to my dad or someone, just saying, if this just doesn't pan out to be something within the next 6 months, I think I'm going to have to pivot. And I think there was something really important and pivotal about maybe just naming that out loud. And that's not at all what happened. Things only picked up and grew and grew and grew. And we're 8 years in, and we are in a season of abundance in many ways, abundant creativity, abundance with collaborative partners, abundance in sustaining what we're doing. And so I was thinking of that moment of weariness and how important it is just to name our weariness and to say it out loud. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a solution for changing things into a successful story that's perfectly packaged, but I do think there's power in that. And it's funny that you asked that question, because with the Sanctified Art, we have a series out right now for Advent called How Does a Weary World Rejoice? And so we've just been steeped in how does a weary world rejoice, like trying to answer this question through art and poems and liturgies and curriculum and sermon planning, like all the materials that we've created around this question of how do we, when we're weary, find joy. And it's really a whole series about joy. And what we've learned is that joy is not a standalone emotion. Joy is one that comes alongside weariness. It comes alongside anxiety and doubt. And those are maybe the moments when we think we resist joy. And yet what we found is that joy can be a spiritual practice. And so those are the things that are coming to mind for me. And I didn't name any of my own personal kind of Sabbath practices, but I do want to name the importance of speaking that weariness out loud, and also leaning into the spiritual practices of resilient and beautiful, abundant joy.
Wow, thank you. That really touched my spirit, to be honest with you. Like, the aspect of like naming the weariness or naming the fear. Because I think I've done that subconsciously, but I don't think I've ever talked about it as being like a conscious aspect of I'm going to say the thing, and then that will then bring me out of that weariness that I was having. But yeah, no, that was really, really, really beautiful. And then like also being with joy, right? And so like kind of in that same aspect of like, and that was a really beautiful relationship, because you're right, like they are one and the same. Like once something brings you down, you look for joy, right? You find that joy to bring you out of that same movement. And so like, which is a sense of self-care, right? Or this idea of taking care of oneself. Because we try to take care of empathetic people, we try to take care of so many other people, we forget sometimes that we also need things that to help us keep going too as well. And so kind of to answer the question Ashley posed, is like, for myself, like I don't live next to anybody that's truly family, like as in like family. And so whenever I feel that weariness, or like what I found in the past is that when I went into this field, I need to go home more. Like being home was important to me, and like being around because every time I go back to Birmingham, see my friends, see people that I've known for the majority of my life, right? It brings that fire within me, right? They, even hearing them say, we really appreciate what you're doing, we really love the things that you're enacting, gives me that fire, right? That gives me the encouragement to give me that second win to come back here in Ames, where I sometimes am on an island, to be like, okay, I'm ready to go again. And so it's like finding those safe spaces of where not only safe spaces to relax, but then also safe spaces that will bring you that laugh, that joy, that medicine that you need to be like, okay, today was rough, but I'm ready to go again tomorrow. This was a good palate cleanser to refocus, recenter my own emotions, to take another step forward towards that goal that I have for my own organization. So Lyle, thank you so much for that point. That was really beautiful.
I love that, Cameron, because it's kind of connected to what I was thinking about. So around kind of being with our people, I think that I've heard that 80% of pastors are introverts, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, because it's such an extroverted profession that knowing who you are and what you need is really important. So honoring that. I'm an extrovert. I'm an off the charts extrovert. It's one of Darnell's favorite things about me. And so I need people, and generally people outside. I mean, Cameron, kind of like you were talking about, people who are outside of my work world, outside of even the people who understand what I'm trying to create and are invested in it, but don't need that to be the center of what we're talking about. I used to work with a woman, and I saw her at work on Monday one day, and I was like, Maddie, what did you do this weekend? And she was like, I was on a movie set. And I was like, oh yeah, how come? And she was like, because I'm cousins with Samuel L. Jackson. And I was like, you're cousins with Samuel L. Jackson? She's like, yeah. So he gave us a tour of the movie studio, or the movie set where they were filming in DC. And I was like, were you all awestruck? And she's like, no, here's why he still hangs out with us. Because at one point, our uncle said to him, Sammy, good for you, but we still remember when you were getting government cheese. And I think her point was like, he actually needed someone in his life who's like, we remember you from what? And for me, I think I've got people in my life who are like, some other people may think you're fancy and impressive. I knew you when. And those are the folks I tend to turn to put me back together, so I have the energy for the work.
I love it. Thank each of you for this was just an enriching evening, and I appreciate the wisdom, the experience that was shared. We really, really value y'all. If you're watching, you should have received the link to their recordings, and then you'll get a link early next week with the recording from tonight. But we want to thank everybody. And for those of you who, you're responding to the cries of God's people, you hear God's people crying, and maybe it's resonating with something in your history and your story, and you're interested in launching something, maybe you have an idea, maybe you're in the very early stages of launching some kind of social impact venture. The application for our Scent cohort for next year, 2024, that will close on October 1st. So we encourage you to get those applications submitted. You're welcome to send myself or Darnell an email if you have any questions, but we thank each of you, and we look forward to our final week of the Scent seminar, Scent September next week. But thank you for making tonight just like so lovely. It was good to be with each of you, and we'll see you next week.